Haru Kono, the Special Representative of the Government of Japan for the Middle East and Europe, and former ambassador to Italy and to Russia. Please take a seat. We have Cory Sharkey, who we all saw yesterday, the Deputy Director of IISS, and formerly from the NSC. And then we have Sakil Park, who's the Director of Research and Strategy at Liberty in North Korea. This is an incredibly timely topic, and I'm actually going to make you all start working immediately, because I want to put a question up on the screens, if I may. And the question is this: given in the aftermath of this week's announcements, and I don't think I need to tell you what this week's announcements are, what do you think is the likely future on the peninsula? Is this a fundamentally different moment than we've seen before, and we should all embrace the opportunity to denuclearize North Korea and bring them in? Is it a different moment, but actually we think this is going to be escalation and new conflict? Or is this a little bit of a shrug? You know what, 6 months from now we're going to be in the same place. Please answer. And I will tell you right now, at the end of this, we're going to come back to this, and I'm going to be interested to see whether views have changed during that period. But let me, because we have such a little time, I'm not going to wait for this to finish. I'm going to actually move straight to the questions. And Sakil, I want to start with you. Talk to us a little bit about regime stability. Do we have a negotiating partner in the North Korean leader or not?
Right, so I think that this kind of bigger picture question is really important. I understand that the video of the trailer of the documentary that we produced was shown at the end of the last session, and so some of you may have seen that. I'm gonna give it a quick hard plug. This is available for you guys to watch the whole thing, 50 minutes from the Forum app. And so if you go into the session, this session, and go to the bottom under features, you can go, and a lot of you guys, I'm sure, are taking transport to go back home after this forum. So that is a great time to watch it. And the documentary itself is very much focused on North Korean social change and urban youth in North Korea that are driving interesting changes inside the country, both economic changes and information changes, leading to cultural and social changes. And that, I think, is one of the things that's really missing from a lot of the discussion on North Korea, which is that, frankly, even the title of this session, Neutralizing the North Korean Threat, this is how we deal with North Korea, right? We approach it as a security problem, and pretty much just that. North Korea is a country which presents security problems, but it's not just that. It's not just a security problem. It's not just Kim Jong-un, nuclear weapons, and missiles. North Korea is a country of 25 million people. It is an economy, a society, a culture. And the good news is that those things are changing, and there are things that we can do to interact with those changes and bring forward it. So overall, I think that one of the problems is that, we can think of it like this. Focusing on the nuclear weapons and missiles is focusing on the symptom of a problem. It's not the underlying cause. The underlying cause is the nature of North Korea as a country. That's why we keep on going back and forth between negotiations and tensions and negotiations and tensions. Because underlying it, the nature of the North Korean kind of regime and country is fundamentally the same. So that would be my major point for today. We need to take a much more holistic approach towards North Korea and target more the soft underbelly of North Korean society, because actually that's where the international community has a lot of advantages.
I want to come back to that because I think it's an important point. We see Kim Jong-un as our negotiator, but are there things that we can do to help him to be able to negotiate if he wanted to? But Cory, I want to come to you next. And I want to ask you, the US government has talked a lot about military options and preemption. Is there a military solution to this? Is there something that we can militarily do, or is that just a pipe dream?
Well, there's a lot we can militarily do. Unfortunately, very little of what we could militarily do will address the kinds of perspectives that he just talked about. Moreover, there's very little we could do militarily that would be supported by our allies. The administration's strategy seems to be to try and ramp up as much as possible the pressure on North Korea. and to threaten that if North Korea doesn't capitulate in giving up its nuclear weapons, that we will preventatively destroy them. But even in the best possible circumstances of that military operation, one of incredible virtuosity where we could identify and destroy all of the nuclear weapons and infrastructure, where we could destroy all of the missiles, dispersed or undispersed, before they get targeted at Japan and at my beloved California. Even if we could prevent North Korean special forces from undertaking assassinations of the political leadership in South Korea, and even if we could target those 12,000 artillery tubes that are aimed at South Korea, if we could destroy those in the space of 3 hours, that would be a military achievement of extraordinary virtuosity, and you still probably have hundreds of thousands of dead South Koreans. And for the United States to choose that outcome, as opposed to respond to an attack on us, or to have faith that we can actually deter the North Koreans irrespective of their weaponry, I think that making that choice would have enormous and negative geopolitical consequences for our country and for our closest friends.
So essentially, we have a military deterrent potentially, but no military solution, realistic military solution.
Yeah, I should have said it that way. Succinctly put, Xenia.
This is why I love Corey. Martha, I want to come to you. And actually, I'm going to come to you all almost immediately. We've got 45 minutes. We don't have enough time. There are a lot of smart people in the room. So if you have questions, you're on in about 2 minutes. But Masa, let me come to you. You've been watching this from Japan. I mean, the last week has been... I'm not sure that I have the word to describe it. How do you interpret what's going on? How do you interpret the recent moves?
Well, thank you. And he explained to us about the society is changing. But I'm just wondering whether the leadership is changing at all. I have a few explanation or interpretation of what happened, what's going on right now. Probably I can explain 3 things. So the first two, one is the rather conventional explanation. The last one is a rather realistic explanation of this situation. The first one is I'm sorry, I'm a government bureaucrat, so I'm always very cautious and also rather pessimistic on this issue. But first and foremost, I'd like to say whether this is a good time to stop and think about it. Then the first point is whether is this a famous or infamous time-buying tactics by North Korean leaders. Well, you know, we had a very bitter experience for the last 20 years, way back to 1994, based on the framework agreement with the United States. But they means North Korea. North Korea promised to abandon their nuclear ambition, but they betrayed us. They kept doing their own development of nuclear and missile program. That was one thing. And also the second time in 2005 or 6 or 7, the same thing happened. So whether this message by the leader of North Korea is another time-buying tactics to continue to complete their nuclear and missile programs. Second point is whether this is a very cunning tactics or shrewd tactics of North Korea to make a wedge between the countries among Japan, United States, and China, and South Korea. Or they are driving the wedge among us, or they are driving a wedge between China and our like-minded countries like United States, South Korea, and Japan. And also, maybe, this is Atlantic Alliance discussions, but they may make a kind of a driving a wedge between Europe and the United States, Atlantic. This is this is one of my worries and concerns about it. Third point, I would like to make it short. But one thing which I can realistically think is that we have been doing a pressure campaign based upon the Security Council resolutions. It seems to me that we believe that this continuous pressure campaign is now working. That should be the reason why North Korean leaders took this kind of decision and send a message to us. Well, those are what we feel at this moment. But this is, again, a good time to ponder what's going to go next.
So I'm going to come quickly. So you gave us three potential reasons. One was a time-buying tactic.
Time-buying.
The second one was as a wedge to separate the allies. And the third was because they're being pressurized. And Japan thinks it's the third?
Yeah, well, certainly we are convinced that the third one is working.
Working, fantastic.
And it's a kind of a mystery whether the first one and second one will come up again.
Okay, fantastic. I'm now going to start bringing in some people. I want to actually bring in Wendy first of all. She was warned a little bit that I might call upon her, and I know she has to run. Wendy, is this different? Is this a different moment?
First of all terrific introductory comments, and I think represent all three of the pieces of this: the people, the actual people of North Korea and the horrible life which most of them have to lead, the military position that we're in, and one has to have a credible threat of force in service of diplomacy if diplomacy is going to work, and as you pointed out, the pressure that is also one of the other tools that's essential here. I think that looking forward, there are a few things I think we all have to keep in mind. First, we can learn lessons from previous negotiations with North Korea, but we are in a very different place. And so we cannot draw too many lessons out of the past and say that's what's going to happen this time, because North Korea now has nuclear weapons and they have the means to deliver them. And that has not been the case in previous rounds of negotiations to the extent that it is right now. Secondly, there are changes going on in North Korea. I agree with that, but we have a time problem here. Those changes are not going to happen in time. And we don't want to use military action to force regime change because it would be catastrophic for the people in the region, as well as the people in North Korea, quite frankly. It's not just hundreds of thousands who would die in South Korea and Japan, but in North Korea as well. So we have a time sequence problem. And the third thing I would point out is that, as I said this morning, for those who were at breakfast, this is about the future of Asia and who defines the future of Asia. And the United States, with our allies and partners, Japan and South Korea, should, as a Pacific power, want to have something to say about that and how we go forward. China, that wants this negotiation to go forward, I think is going to be very conflicted as it goes forward because they want to control the future of China. So this is going to be a very tough go. If the president moves ahead, and I hope he does, it is the beginning of a very long process in which he has to have patience, persistence, and a pointed strategy going forward that's extremely well prepared. I don't see any of that right at the moment, but I'm hoping.
Am I allowed to call you out? Did you choose 1, 2, or 3 of the answers? You didn't vote. Okay. I will say that, thank you, Wendy. I will say that I don't know if you looked at the numbers. It was 15% who thought this was a different moment and there was a real opportunity. It was 30% who thought that this was a new moment and it wasn't going to end well. And 55% said, yeah, shrug. Whatever. There's somebody else I want to bring in from the audience, and I can't see him at the moment. I want to bring in Dong Wang. There you go. Dong Wang is a professor at University of Peking, because I would love to get the Chinese perspective on what's going on, just briefly.
Sure. Oh, well, I think, of course, from the Chinese perspective, this is actually what China has been advocating for many, many years. Just to give diplomacy a chance. In fact, I have questions for speakers here.
Go ahead.
Very brief. So my question is that I would like to have your assessment about the likelihood. Let's assume the negotiations will be going on in the best sort of case scenario. We're going on well, and we gradually moving toward denuclearization, everything. I would like to get your assessment, a sense of how likely you believe it will gradually lead to North Korea opening up and style reform and everything, because this is actually another part, very important piece of the Chinese sort of vision, as Wendy just noted. China also has its own vision about how this whole thing, East Asia, including the North Korea, Korean Peninsula, moving toward. And fundamentally, we believe and we strongly support vision of peaceful development. We wanted denuclearization plus North Korea gradually moving toward opening up and style reform. So I would like to get a sense from you. Thank you.
But at the moment, you think China is very positive about what's going on?
But of course, we're also being we are not being naive about all the potential barriers and everything, previous patterns. But we want to be very encouraging.
What did you vote?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
You didn't vote as well. Okay, so only for the people who voted, you get to stick your hands up. I actually want to get a European view, and then I will come back. A European. There's got to be a European that is watching North Korea and has some thoughts. And if you're not careful, I will start cold calling. There you go.
She'll do it too.
Yeah.
Heinrich Kräfte, German diplomat, count in Luxembourg. We heard that we need a holistic approach on North Korea. Don't we also need a holistic approach on South Korea? Is it not the time for the US government to back the South Korean government in this specific moment instead of targeting South Korea on trade and many other issues?
Great question. I do have a question for the Europeans, and then I'm giving my panelists a moment to think about the two issues that were brought up. Something that I don't understand from the European perspective, why is Europe so passive about the threat from North Korea? You know, the North Koreans can reach Europe. And, well, I'm saying, no, they're not passive. I'm going to come and catch you on that one. But let me, did you want to respond to the...
So a couple of quick things. I'm not surprised the Chinese are thrilled by this, because President Trump's policy had been that we wouldn't negotiate with the North Koreans until they accepted denuclearization. And he let that go by the wayside yesterday. So that is a big, important change. But he made the big, important change for a really good reason, which is South Korea asked us to. And we can't credibly carry out a strategy unless Japan and South Korea support that strategy, because they are the allies most affected by it. So as much as Wendy's concerns are justified about the president's erratic poor judgment, erratic behavior and poor judgment, the White House actually made a really important shift yesterday, which is negotiations are a good thing in and of their own right, with no preconditions by us, evidently, since the president said yes. And it was at the behest of the ally most affected by it. I think that's a great development.
As I said, we had a rather bitter experience in the past. So Chinese comment, I appreciate that very much. And I also appreciate and rather judge favorably that there will be a discussion, the meeting between the leader of North Korea and President Trump on this matter. But based upon our bitter experience, we would like to see more concrete action. There is an announcement, joint announcement by North and South Korea. If you read the document very carefully, there are some rooms for interpretation. That is, we have to pay more attention to it. For example, North Korea showed their will toward the denuclearization. But what does it mean? They made a commitment to denuclearization, but how to do it, this concrete measure should be tested. And probably against many of your wishes and my wishes too, the negotiation and talks between the United States and North Korea will start, but due to be the first stage of the long process of negotiation. That's what I feel. And it is so, having all said that, it is a bit too early to make a judgment at this stage. We have to be very careful on that.
Thank you. Will you perhaps address the question there in the corner about
the South Korea?
Yeah.
South Korea side? Yeah, sure. I mean, President Moon is getting a lot of credit in South Korea right now, as you can maybe imagine, and amongst analysts looking at this as well. If we think that just 12 months ago, he became the president, and even less than 12 months ago, in fact, and he was facing a very difficult situation with China, with THAAD, the US-led kind of missile defense system, facing a very difficult situation between Trump and Kim Jong-un and the chance of war and these kind of things. And there's been significant improvement and resolution of the issues with China. And he's going to be meeting with Kim Jong-un next month, and the month after, hopefully, I guess, Trump will be meeting with Kim Jong-un. And so, there's a lot of questions about who's in the driving seat here. Is Kim Jong-un in the driving seat? Is Moon Jae-in in the driving seat? Not that many people, I think that Trump is in the driving seat. But, it's been a difficult situation. But at this point, I'm not sure if we can say that the US government has not been supporting South Korea sufficiently. I think that Madeleine Albright yesterday pointed out the kind of weird optics that, in fact, it was the South Korean government officials that announced that Trump is probably going to meet with Kim Jong-un in a couple of months' time from the White House lawn. And so, in fact, the South Koreans have been able to lead from the front, at least in the optics.
Yeah.
And one more point on that. There's a fair amount of kind of concern on the lack of preparation and also the lack of kind of a team in DC with the loss of key personnel, still not having an ambassador in Seoul, South Korea, losing other senior people that have been working on North Korea for many decades. In a way, we're in a very kind of non-traditional phase of diplomacy, and Moon Jae-in and the South Korean government are kind of being Trump's team. They're kind of being his preparation, working level talks and those kind of things. And then, Trump is not going to have his Secretary of State meet with the North Korean leadership before he meets with them. But in a way, when Moon meets with Kim Jong-un in April, he has to both do an inter-Korean summit, and he also has to serve a somewhat of a role of what the Secretary of State would have done meeting with Kim Jong-un before the President of the United States does so. And so South Korea right now is actually, in some ways, has a lot of power and control over these processes.
It's a really important point.
Thank you. I see this gentleman. I'm giving Camille Grand a heads up that I'm probably going to come to you at some point.
Snap to Camille.
Exactly. But I'm going to give you a couple of moments to think about what you have to say. Kishwa, very, very quickly, you said Europe isn't being passive.
No. I think if you think of European common foreign and security policy, maybe from that perspective, you can see a different level of passivity vis-à-vis Iran, for example. But the United Kingdom, and I would also argue that many of the European countries individually are taking a very careful line, particularly the UK and the Security Council, because of the US line being so unpredictable. Okay. And China is the joker in the pack. I mean, I'm delighted to hear that somebody telling us that China really welcomes this. But we are so exposed in Europe to China's investment, China's other strategic ambitions in the region, that we feel slightly unsettled by what China is going to do or say.
I can understand that. Let me come to the gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. Hiro Akita from Nikkei newspaper from Tokyo. Since I'm one of the biggest victims of North Korea, because my editor from Tokyo called me 2 days ago, and I couldn't sleep because I needed to write an analysis story about Mr. Trump. So maybe because of that, I'm a little bit cynical. if people talk about Mr. Trump's plan to meet Kim Jong-un, if preparation is good enough, still, is it good idea to meet Mr. Kim right now? If, as Japanese ambassador said, if North Korea's intention might be buying time, maybe it will give more time for him to push forward the program without any verification that he will freeze or not. So this question, maybe answer will be based on two premises. One premise is that North Korea is developing nuclear missiles to make a grand bargain. By abandoning it, maybe they may want to get security assurance. Mm-hmm. So they are willing to abandon it. Or another premise is, no, they don't want to be like Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or Libya, or Gaddafi. So they are now changed their mind, strategic calculation, and they will persistently push forward nuclear program, and thereby they will be a nuclear state, and they will never change. If second hypothesis is correct, I wonder if talking with North Korea at this moment is a good idea or not.
Great question. Hold that thought. I want to bring Camille. He's had plenty of time to think about it. I want to bring Camille.
Thank you, Xenia, for bringing in a NATO bureaucrat into this conversation. No, three things.
Who knows an awful lot about disarmament and such, yes.
No, but the three things. First of all, on the issue of whether the Europeans are relevant or irrelevant, maybe a note of caution both to our American friends and our Asian friends, which is it is difficult at times to have literally in the same sentence, a first part of the sentence which is pay much more attention to this region and what's happening there and stop ignoring the region. And when a European says, yes, indeed, that's important and we have ideas or things to bring to the table, the answer is, oh, but you're completely irrelevant. So there, I think there is a need to build up that conversation also in a transatlantic fashion on Asian security in general and the Korean Peninsula in particular. Having said all of this, of course, the relevance of EU or NATO in that conversation is limited. You might remember that the NATO Secretary General went to Seoul and Tokyo in the middle of the peak of the crisis, partially to demonstrate solidarity to partners and the close partnership that is there. The second thing I would say, which is what you alluded to when you said, by the way, the threat is here as well. For the audience, the closest NATO capital to North Korea in terms of missile range is Tallinn. And here the Estonians say, why us again? But but the reality, and it's much closer than Washington and so on. And even if you do the math, closer than the West Coast. So in a way, we have to think about that because we can't completely ignore it, even though there are no direct threats, and we shouldn't, get overexcited about the notion that we are under a missile threat as we speak. So all of this leads to think about that, and also in terms of the close Asian partners and the relationship with the Asian partners, which has to do with security, and the transatlantic relationship, because should things go right or wrong, there is a transatlantic dimension to the relationship and our ability to talk to each other.
Thank you, Camille. I'm going to bring in one other question over here, and then I'm going to come back to the panelists. So thinking caps on.
Hi, Laura Rosenberger at GMF. I worked on North Korea in both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. I feel like in this conversation we are projecting more of a policy or a strategy on the Trump administration than actually exists. If you read the accounts of how the decision was made to accept the invitation for a meeting, at least according to the reporting that's come out, it wasn't a White House decision or an administration decision. It was the president's decision and his alone. It's not entirely clear to me if there are preconditions or not. Corey, I think you indicated that it appears that there's not. We have different messages coming from the White House podium as to whether or not there are. I'm deeply concerned by this lack of clarity about whether there is a policy, whether there is a strategy. I think it's generous at best to call these negotiations. Basically, there's been discussion of having a meeting, and that's about it. And while I believe deeply in standing closely with our South Korean allies, I also think it's important to remember that we have to be about US interests. And part of that is standing with the alliance, but having Moon Jae-in, with all due respect to him, be our lead negotiator with Kim Jong-un doesn't really sound to me as a former American diplomat like the way I'd like to see policy and our diplomacy conducted. And the last point I would make is one of the most concerning things to me as well about how the decision-making apparently went down is that our Japanese allies weren't informed or consulted with in advance. And so I guess my question is then, given what we do know about what is apparently the environment for this, what are the pitfalls and how do we guard against them? Because we are where we are, but how do we hedge against the pitfalls that we see ahead here?
So I'm going to fire on my good friend Laura Rosenberger because I think the Obama administration critique that, oh my God, this isn't being done the way it should be done and proper processes would be so much more weighty if the Obama administration had handled this problem in the last 8 years of their administration. Yes, the president's reckless, yet he has actually taken an important initiative that gets him out of the bind he put himself in, which is to say North Korea can't be deterred and time's running out of the hourglass. The two big contradictions in his policy were that a policy of slow strangulation of the North Korean government is one that requires time, and that does appear to be working. They got 2 rounds of unanimous UN Security Council resolutions that are quite biting on the North Koreans. They got the Russians and the Chinese to agree you could actually board suspect ships. That's a huge diplomatic achievement, and it should have been done a long time ago, and it wasn't. The second thing is to respond to the Japanese journalist's concerns. I share your view that there's lots of downside risk, and Laura rightly points that out as well. But there's also lots of upside opportunity, right? And there are 3 really important reasons the administration ought to be in negotiations with the North Koreans on almost any terms. The first is that North Korea is the most isolated country in the world, and we understand very little about what's going on there. This is a problem with a very slim margin of error and a great likelihood that we're going to get a lot of things wrong. So talking to the North Koreans could help us understand better what's going on. That's useful in and of itself. The second thing is that I cannot imagine that America's closest friends and allies, the South Koreans and the Japanese, are going to agree to proceed with the administration's strategy of a preventative strike on the North Korean facilities without an extended period of negotiations that proves to all of us that we have no alternative to that. And the third big reason is my mom's not going to want to do that either until she is persuaded that there's no alternative to doing this. Negotiations are essential to persuade free societies to go to war. And so we ought all to be in favor of the guy who, after all, got elected to make American foreign policy, making American foreign policy.
I fully agree with what you said. It's a brighter side of the future. Let me make a couple of comments on the role of Europe. You said that, well, unfortunately enough, my government, my country, doesn't have any communication tool with North Korea. But in case of Europe, there are at least 47 countries who are having a diplomatic relationship with North Korea. How to utilize these communication line between European countries and North Korea? That we have to think about it in the future. Of course, we've like, as I said before, we have to maintain our pressure campaign as this is a good result came out. So we have to keep doing that. But not by the intermediary roles by the Europe, but join us on the same, we are on the same boat to keep pressure upon North Korea. But there should be some rooms where the European countries can play a role as you have a communication line with North Korea. Well, somebody mentioned about the lack of communication between Japan and North Korea, and we were informed by the United States of the recent, latest progress by South Korea and also the United States. Well, I have no concern about that. We have a very excellent communication between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe. They have been communicating. Even a few days ago, they had a very lengthy telephone conversation, and there's no misunderstanding between United States and Japan on this particular issue. I'd like to say that.
Great, Saka.
Yeah, if I could build on Mass's point on the Europe question. Again, this may be slightly kind of non-traditional in diplomacy, but I think that we should think about role differentiation. This is a very difficult, long-term, multifaceted kind of problem. And if you like, over the last 12 months or so, there's already been role differentiation between the US and South Korea, playing, probably unintentionally, kind of a good cop, bad cop kind of strategy, where obviously Seoul is the good cop and the US is a bad cop. And it's ended up in this moment, one way or another, where Kim Jong-un is coming to the table, and Trump and Moon are accepting those offers. So I think that Europe can play a role. You know, the fact that there are several European embassies in Pyongyang is one thing. North Korean diplomats over here as well. But maybe in the bigger picture, if I can kind of be grand for 1 second and make an appeal. I'm Korean British, by the way. My nationality is British, and so while I still can, I'm gonna say, fellow Europeans, if we're gonna reboot the liberal order, do some of these things that Bob Kagan was talking about on the first day, reboot the liberal order, lead kind of a promotion of Enlightenment values, fulfill European potential and a European vision and these kind of things. I think that it's very important. It's a long-term project, but Europe can't just be for Europeans, for European issues, European interests, and so on. Nowhere more so than North Korea, should European values be applied. North Korea is the most illiberal country in the world. It's the most closed, systematically repressive country in the world. North Korea is the antithesis to European vision and European values. And so in order to fulfill and develop a positive, renewed European identity and values, I think that Europe needs to be involved deeply in various different ways on North Korea for those reasons as well.
I want to amplify one point about Camille's point about Europeans, because it's a point he taught me, which is that a number of Europeans were participants in the Korean War and would be potential signatories to any future peace treaty between North Korea and the United States.
So this is truly a transatlantic issue. Stephen.
Corey, maybe to my old colleague, but maybe to other members of the panel, is an ideal outcome from a North Korean point of view and the Chinese point of view that you have these negotiations, the United States is humiliated, North Korea gets to keep its weapons. From China's perspective, the position of the United States is weakened. If you look at the big players, isn't that an outcome that you would prefer? And Trump has walked right into this trap.
Hold the answer, Corey. I'm going to get 2 other questions out because we're running out of time and I want to get as many as I can on the table. Christoph. And Nancy,
Christoph and Masha, I would be interested in the judgment what role China is playing, how you would judge how constructive they are or not. And the question behind for me is, this is one of the big issues which can make superpower, or they can fail the test to become a superpower. And given the enormous influence which China has economically on North Korea, I would have expected that they could play a bigger role. And this comes in a time when generally in the West, the doubts whether China is a national interest power or has a responsibility, sees a responsibility, a greater responsibility, the doubts are mounting as far as I see. So I think this is a very significant moment which decides how China will be seen in the world.
Thank you. Nancy, I'm coming over to you. Okay, that's it. I'm getting 4 questions, then I'm stopping. Nancy.
Thanks. I want to go back. I want to bring the people of North Korea back into this. And, you know, I spent 14 years going in and out of North Korea, and without question, enormous change, especially economically, and Pyongyang is a very different city than it used to be. But there's still a crushing control and crushing isolation. And I want to get your sense of where you think that might be going, especially at a time where Kim Jong-un seems to be increasing the legitimacy of his regime with some pretty large PR coups, with the Olympics, with the nuclear tests, and maybe now with the summit. And how do you see any of that translating into what I think everybody hopes would be change for the North Korean people?
Yeah, and you know, can we treat North Korea like a normal power where we've got leverage and we've got chits, essentially? Steve.
Shenya. Steve Clemens with The Atlantic. I've been surprised by the discussion that there hasn't been more critique of Donald Trump's lack of empathy or concern for other countries' existential threats while he's pounding the table and saying, this is our concern and we demand the world pay attention. And I'm wondering at what point people think that this could be America's Suez crisis at some point, where we set ourselves up in a situation where we may have Japan on one hand, we may have others, but fundamentally we're all pretending that the rest of the world shares the same concerns. And I would turn Christoph's point on its head, that China can sit very comfortably with regard to however this comes out, China's going to be fine. But America, North Korea gives China strategic depth with the United States with this, and it's the United States in the vice, not China in the vice. No one else is in the vice. But I've been interested in just that tantrum that Donald Trump tends to pull and those speeches he gives where he doesn't communicate to the rest of the world that America will be there when they have an existential challenge, but we want them to worry on what he's defining as our existential challenge.
Thank you, Steve. We've got just a few minutes each, so I'm going to do in reverse order, answer the questions that you want, make any final comments. But I also, if we can at the same time, put the question back up. And I'd like people to get out their mobile telephones. And I'd be interested to see whether views have changed at all. But Masa.
China. On the issue of China, a very important member of the Security Council and also the member of the six-party talks. And China has been playing a very important role and to follow the resolution things. And as you may all know, that 90% of the trade of the North Korea is with China, and they are taking the very strict economic measures, and that has been very effective for this pressure campaign as of today. I'd like to say a bit about the people of North Korea. This has nothing to do with the recent situation, but my own personal experience. When I visited North Korea about 15, 16 years ago twice, I had a chance to meet with the ordinary people in North Korea. And this is a very important point, but I felt very strongly that we can get along with these people. We have a kind of a meeting of mind with the needy people, pregnant lady, elderly people, orphanage people, and so on. So, you know, unlike other issues in the international society, this issue, North Korean issue, is a rather simple issue. This is a matter of nuclear missile. Once we solve this issue, and for us, Japan, we have a humanitarian issue called abduction to solve this issue and liquidation of the past at the Second World War things, then I am very much confident we can nicely get along with Korean people. That is my tiny bit of a hope.
Excellent.
As long as to finish those difficult issues too.
We love hope. Corey, give us more hope.
That I cannot do on this subject. But to answer Steve and Steve.
Shaquille, give us more. No, sorry, Corey.
I absolutely agree with your critique. The administration adopted a strategy that maximizes the political value to North Korea of possessing nuclear weapons. A much smarter strategy would have been to say that since 1953, American strategy has been that any act of violence by the North Koreans, an attack by North Korea on the United States or its allies, will result in military retaliation that the regime leadership will not survive. And we should have continued to have that as our strategy because that minimizes the value to them of crossing the nuclear threshold. And it maximizes the likelihood of carrying Japan and South Korea along on whatever we feel we need to do. But the administration did not adopt that strategy, and the one they have adopted plays us into a binary choice of either acknowledging a nuclear-armed North Korea and the political value of that, or destroying the North Korean nuclear infrastructure with all of the attendant consequences. So I agree there were a lot better outcomes. Given the range of choice at this moment, I think the best outcome is giving North Korea the political stature they want, hope that the Chinese will actually work with us to open up North Korea, because the best outcome for everybody is regime change in North Korea.
Sakil, last word.
Sure. So to the question on North Korean people, and thank you for that, you know, it is true that there is no organized opposition in North Korea. There's not a single known dissenter in North Korea, right? There's not a single person that we can point to who can say that person inside the country is speaking with a different voice to the North Korean government. I think that that's unique in the world. However, there is positive economic change. There is a decentralization of kind of the economy, a growth of a constrained and in many ways camouflaged, but nonetheless capitalist economy. There is important information and media changes. North Korean people are getting more access to media and information from the outside world and so on. This is leading to overall positive social and cultural change, I believe. So in terms of whether change and opening of North Korea are possible and so on, my answer would be that actually the train has left the station. Change and opening of North Korea is already happening. Yay. A lot of that, yeah, that's the hopeful point. A lot of that is people-driven. It's a long way from where we want it to be. A lot of these changes, because of North Korea is the way that it is, it's hard to see, but it's nonetheless happening. And I work with North Korean refugees, and when we speak with them, you know, people who left 10 years ago, 5 years ago, this year, we see how those kind of changes are playing out. And so that's the hope on this issue. And I think that fundamentally, in order to solve all of these issues around North Korea, we do need to see a different, changed, transformed North Korea as a country. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let me stop there. Let me just quickly look at the screens. Rather, from my perspective, depressingly, we think this is more of the same. But I suppose it could be worse. We could have higher numbers on the second scenario. That's actually gone down. Less people think that it will lead to escalation and new conflict. Thank you all for sticking around, for being here. Apologies from me that we went over a couple of minutes. Apologies from me, GMF, that we went over a couple of minutes. But will you join me in thanking our panelists very much? Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the executive editor of